Hello and welcome to another video on Inkscape. In this video I'm going to be building up this simple border design and I'm going to be introducing you to clip groups and the watercolor filter. Stay tuned. So the first thing I want to do is create a petal. So I'm going to come over to our stars and polygon tool. If we click on that we can just drag out and see what shape we've got. We've got a 5-pointed star at the moment, so we're going to make some changes to our shape to start with. So first thing I want to do is convert it to a polygon, so we just get a nice standard shape. I want to make it into a triangle, so we're going to reduce that down to 3 corners, and I want to add some rounding to make it a more petal shape look. So we're just going to press on the plus until it's, I think around about there will do me. So I'm going to grab my selection tool, I'm going to delete that. But now we've got the shape set up, I'm going to come back into the polygons tool, I'm going to hold down control and I'm just going to drag out the shape. By holding down control we can get it standing nicely upright while we're working on it, like so. I'm now going to convert this to a path in its own right, so it's no longer an object, a shape object, it becomes a path. So if we come up to path, we can come down to object to path. Now if we come down and get our nodes tool, we can see now that we've got nodes around the outside. So I want to put a dent in the top of our petal up here. So I need a few extra nodes at the top here. So what I'm going to do is just drag a box over these top 2 nodes to select them. I'm then going to come over and I'm going to click on this plus symbol at the top here, which adds a node in between the selected nodes. I'm going to do it again to add a couple more nodes. So then I'm going to deselect by clicking off. I'm going to grab the middle one at the top and just pull it down slightly to create this slight dent in the top of our petal. Next thing I want to do is make this into a sharp corner. At the moment it's a smooth node, so if we select it, we can come up to our different nodes here, and we go to the first one, which is custom node or corner node. We click on that, and that turns it to a custom node. If we click on it again, it gets rid of the handles and turns it into a sharp point. So we can drag that down to create a better petal shape. So now we've got the shape of our petal. What I want to do is just make some adjustments to it. So first thing I want to do is change the fill color. So I'll just get the selection tool, change the fill color. I'm going to come down to the bottom here and I'm going to click on the white to fill it to white. I next want to give it a stroke. So I'm going to hold down my shift key and then I'm going to give it a darkish pink stroke. So let's go that one. Well, there's a bit dark on that. Let's go one less. That's quite thick, so I'm going to thin it slightly. So if we come down here, we can right click on the number down here. And this is the width of our stroke, so we change that to 4. And I think I'm quite happy that as the shape of my petal. So the next thing I want to do now is to create several of these petals around in a circle. So I just, with my roller button, I'll just drag it over to the center. With it selected, I'm going to come up to Path and down to Path Effects. This opens up our Path Effect dialog box on the right hand side. We can then add a path effect, so we can come down to the bottom, click on the plus, and it gives us our selection of different path effects that we can use. We want rotate copies. You can either start typing it in at the top or just scroll down till you can find it. So let's click on this one. And this arranges copies of our petal on our page for us. We can change the number of copies. We can do a few other bits and bobs. If you look on the channel, there is a video which covers this in greater depth. I'm going to come over and get the nodes tool. And if we select the node in the center here, this just controls where the center of our arrangement is. So we can drag it down below our petal to line it up nicely. I think that looks okay, we'll stick with that. Now we've created this flower shape, we need to convert it so it's a path in its own right. So we come up to Path, down to Object to Path, and as you can see we've now got nodes around all of the petals and the path effect has disappeared. So I'm just going to shrink that down a bit because it's a little bit on the large side. I'm going to hold down Control to constrain the proportions and I'm going to shrink that down a bit. And there we have the basis for our petals. So at the moment we've got the fill set to white, which is good. We've got the stroke set to red. So I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to put a slight shadow behind our petals. So what I'm going to do is press Control D to duplicate it while it's selected. I'm then going to change our copy fill color to black. I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to remove the stroke. I'm then going to, if we come up to our fill and stroke dialog box up here, click on that one. I'm just going to add a little bit of blur. So only a small amount of blur, and then I'm going to drop that to the bottom. So we can come up here and click on this button, lower selection to bottom, and that puts it behind our background. Can't actually see it doing anything at the moment, but what it will do is it will put a slight shadow behind our flower. So now we've got to this stage, I want to turn our flower into a clip group. To do this, I'm going to right click on our flower and I'm going to come down to clip group. If we come back to our objects dialog box, we've now got this group set in the center here. So this is our clip group for our flower petals. We can open it up. Let's just change the name of this so we don't get too confused. So that one's shadow, and this is the flower clip group. So we can open up our flower clip group, and inside we've got clip, which is just another group of objects, and inside that group is our original path. So I'm just going to change the name of that so it doesn't get too confusing, and we just change that to outline. And then what we can do with that is we can blur it slightly. So if we zoom in a bit. So when we created our clip group, what it did was take our original path and use it as a clipping mask. You may have noticed that the stroke on the outside of our path reduced in size. That's because when you put a stroke on a path, you have half of it inside and half of it outside of the path. So when we applied the clipping mask, it cut off the outside section of the stroke. So we've got our original path inside this outline group, which is inside our clip group. I want to reproduce our original path. So with the path selected, I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it, so we've got two of them. And then I'm going to take it outside of that group. So now the path's still inside our outline group. I want to be the outline of the petals. So what I'm going to do is just remove the fill colour to that path. The path above I want to be a white background. So on this one I'm going to remove the stroke. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click on the X at the bottom. So I'm going to double click up here, change this to white background. So the white background, we need to be behind our outline. So if we just grab it and drag it down below our outline. So we've now got that below so we can see our stroke again. So the next thing I need to do is create the watercolor effect. To create the watercolor effect, I'm going to click off. We just go back into our layer 1 at the top here. I'm going to get my ellipse tool and I'm just going to drag out. So I'm going to hold down Control to constrain the proportions. I'm going to drag a circle out over the top of all this. I'm going to give it a fill colour. We're going for a pink, so we go for, oh, that's a bit too bright. Perhaps that one. I'm then going to come up to Filter, down to Textures, and down to Watercolour to add a watercolour effect to our circle. Now we can adjust this. If we come into Filters, we need a Filter dialog box. So if we come up to Filters, click on that, and then you can come down to Filters Editor. In here we've got all the different components that make up a particular filter. These are all individually set to different settings, so you don't want to mess about with them too much. But one you might be interested in is the turbulence, which dictates how grainy our effect is. For the petals, this watercolour effect is quite nice, but in a moment I'm going to be creating the centre of the flower, and I'm going to want that to be more speckled. As it is, I think this effect's not too bad. So if we come back to our object dialog box with our watercolour effect here, so if we just double click on this, we can change that to watercolour. So we can keep everything a little bit more organised. You can adjust the watercolour effect. The simplest way is to just adjust your blur. So I'm going to go to my selection tool. I'm going to hold down Control and Shift just to constrain the proportions and scale it around the centre. I'm just going to drag that out a bit. I think that's quite nice. So what I want to do now is put this watercolour effect inside our clip group. To do that, I'm going to come over to the right here. Our objects dialog box. I'm going to grab hold of watercolour and I'm going to drop it on top of our flower clip group. So we just drag it over, drop it on top, and that'll plonk it inside. Now we need our watercolour to be above our white background and below our outline. So if we select it, we can just drag it up one, plonk it in the right place. Now we've got our red outline on the outside, we've got our watercolour effect, and we've got a white background below that, so that when we put it on top of our flower, on top of other things, we don't get other things showing through our flower. So that's our basic petal design. Next thing I want to do is create a centre. So I'm going to deselect our petals. I'm going to come over and I'm going to grab the ellipse tool. I want to hold down Control to constrain it to a circle. I'm just going to drag out a circle. At the moment it's inside our clip group. We'll fix that in a minute. So we're there. We turn it to a yellow so we can see it clearly. So our path is inside our clip group. To get it outside our clip group, we can just raise it up. When we select it, we can just raise it up and drop it above our clip group so it's outside now. Get our selection tool. We can move it over so we're in line with our flower. I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it. I'm going to make it a darker colour, and then I'm going to hold down Ctrl and Shift to constrain it, its proportions, and scale it around the centre. I'm going to move that in a bit. I'm then going to come up to Filter, down to Textures, down to Watercolor, and give it a watercolor effect. Now I want this watercolor effect to be quite grainy. So if you remember, if we go back to our filters editor, we can come into turbulence and I can increase this base frequency by dragging that up. And as I do it, you'll see the effect becomes more grainy. So I think that's not too bad. So I'm going to leave it there. We come back to our objects dialog box. So we click on the path. So I think that one is our effect. This is where you need to keep everything organized. Grain. We call that one. So our circle one, I'm just going to add a stroke to this. So I want a slightly darker stroke. So I hold down Shift, select a slightly darker colour, perhaps reduce the thickness of that. That is quite big. So we change that down to 3, maybe 2. And I'm going to add a little bit of blur. I'm going to go back into our flower, go into our outline, and open that up to get the original path. So what I'm going to do is just darken the stroke slightly. So if we hold down Shift, so we affect the stroke, then we can make it slightly darker. So I think as a basic flower, that's not too bad. The shadow we could make slightly more blurred, just so it stands out a little bit more. So there we've got our flower. So I'm going to drag over the top of the whole lot, and I'm going to come up and group them all together. Actually say that our grainy effect isn't very visible from this far out. So inside, grain. With our grain selected, I'm going to come back into our filters editor and I'll reduce that a bit. Oh, standard deviation, that's not the one I want, is it? We need to go into our turbulence and reduce our base frequency a little bit. That's better, I think. So we can go back to our objects dialog box. So we've got everything nicely grouped. We can click on this triangle at the front to reduce it down, and we can just call that flower. So that's our flower made for our design. Next thing I want to do is make a leaf. So to make a leaf, all I'm going to do is come over, I'm going to grab the ellipse tool, I'm going to drag out an ellipse, roughly the size of the leaf that I want. So I'm going to come up to path, come down to object to path, change it into a path in its own right. We can get the nodes tool, we can see we've got all the nodes around the outside now. So I'm going to drag a box over these two center nodes. I'm going to change them to sharp cusp nodes, so I'm clicking twice. With them both selected, I'll just push it up a little bit to create this leaf shape, and then we can just come in and we can do a little bit of tweaking to the shape by dragging the sides. We can give it, so this time I'm going to layer it slightly differently. So I think to start with, now we've got our leaf shape, I'm going to create a shadow to sit behind it. So I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it. I'm then going to turn it black. I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to get rid of the stroke. I'm going to add some blur, not too much. I'm going to call that leaf shadow. Then we can drop that down behind. So we get our selection tool, we can drop that to the bottom, and we can see we've got a slight shadow around the outside. I'm then going to press on our leaf again, and I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it again. This time I'm going to put the white background behind. So I'm going to create our white background by pressing on the white. I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to remove the stroke. Then I'm going to drop that down just one space so it sits between the shadow and our leaf that's going to become our clipping group. So there. So that is a leaf white background. And then the top one, I'm going to create our clipping group outline. So I'm going to get rid of the fill color. So I'm going to hold down, I'm going to get rid of the fill color. So I'm going to click on the X to get rid of the fill colour. I'm then going to hold down Shift and I'm going to give it a darker green for the edge of our leaf. And I'll make that slightly thicker, so perhaps change that to 3. I'm then going to convert it to a clip group. So I come down to Create Clip Group. So we call this Leaf Group. So inside our leaf group, we've got our group containing our original path. So if we just take that, we can call that outline. So we'll double click on that. And again, I'm going to blur that slightly just to give it this blurred out edge to our leaf. Next thing I want to do is add our watercolor effect. So I want to grab the ellipse tool, come out of our leaf effect. So we're in layer. What I'll do is I'll click off. So I'm going to come out, I'm going to grab the ellipse tool. I'm going to drag an ellipse over the top. I'm going to change this. I'm going to go up to filters. We're going to change this to our watercolor effect. So down to texture, down to watercolor, and we get our watercolor effect. We can adjust the blur to change the effect if we're not quite happy with it. I'm going to change the graininess of it. So if we come into turbulence, I'm just going to reduce that a bit. And I'll come into fill and stroke dialog, just increase the blur slightly till we get something that we're happy with. I'm actually going to drag that out a bit bigger, so I'm going to hold down Control to constrain the proportions. Just going to drag it out just so I can try and find a point where I'm happy with the fill of that leaf. I think that's all right. So we go back to our objects dialog box. So we can call this leaf watercolor. Oh, if I could spell. So we've got our leaf watercolor. I'm going to drag that in and I'm going to drop it into the leaf group. So I think that's not too bad. I'm going to move the leaf shadow up above our flower. If I select it, we just move that up so we get them all in the right order. I'm going to reduce the leaf shadow slightly. So I'm going to select the leaf shadow. I'm going to come up. Oh, here we go. We can do it down here. I just want to reduce the blur slightly and take it in a little bit. The colour of a watercolour to our leaf is quite dark, so I might select that, come up to our fill and stroke dialog box, and then we can just reduce the colour down a bit just to make it a little bit lighter, like so. And that shadow I'm just going to reduce down a bit again. So leaf, white background, leaf shadow. So we'll select that. I'm just going to reduce the opacity of it. That's better. So now we've got the two elements that we want for our design. We can sit there and build it up. So first thing I'm going to do is going to take all of our leaf bits and just group them all together. So if we drag a box over our leaf, press group, so we can just come up here and change our group to leaf. So now we've just got our two elements sitting there. So we've now got a leaf and we've got our flower. So we can just start building up our design. So if we zoom out a little bit. For this, I'm just going to use circles. So I'm going to come up, click on my circles or ellipse tool, I'm going to hold down Control to constrain it to a circle. I'm going to drag out a perfect circle. So big. I'm going to get rid of the fill colour and I'm going to change by holding down Shift. I'm going to click on a goldy yellow colour. I'll make that slightly thicker. So I'll right click down here and we can change it to 4. That's not too bad. So now I'm going to press, we get our selection tool, I'm going to press Control D to duplicate it. I'm going to create a slight shadow behind this one as well. So I want to hold down Shift, click on the black to create a black outline or stroke, and then I'm just going to blur it very slightly, a bit too much. Like so. I'm going to reduce the opacity and then I'm going to drop that behind the gold ring. So we just drop that down one. We can then grab our selection tool, go over the top of both of them, and we can group them together. Actually what we do is we give it a bit of a gradient as well, I think. So inside our group, we've got our, so that's our gold circle. Going to select our gold circle. We're going to come up to our fill and stroke dialog box. We're going to come into our stroke, change it to a linear gradient, and then we can grab our gradients tool. We can make the other end fully opaque, because at the moment the alpha channel's set to fully transparent, so we're going to drag that up so it's fully opaque. We're going to add an extra point by double clicking on the line. So now we've got an extra stop. We can click on that stop, and then I'm just going to lighten it slightly, like so. We can then click out of our tool. We can go into our objects dialog box. We can reduce down our circle, and I'm going to just rotate that slightly. So if we just click on it to get the rotation handles, we can just rotate that round a bit, like so. That's one. Select our circle, press Ctrl D to duplicate, and a bit more. We can move it slightly. So, and Ctrl D to duplicate again. Around about there. Click on it again. Select that middle stroke. I'm just going to darken that slightly because it is a bit light on those ones. It's better. So we can come out. We can start building up our design now. So I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it. Just going to skew that slightly just to give it a little bit. Then we can rotate it around so it looks like it's sitting nicely on our design. We do the same with this one. So we're just going to skew it a little bit. That one needs bringing up a touch. So we come up, bring it up above our circles. Press Ctrl D to duplicate, get another one. Do the same with this one. Drop that one down behind our flower. And we can take our leaf. Then we can press Ctrl D to duplicate it. Ctrl D. So we're just dropping these down now behind our flowers. Oh, too far. Bring it up a couple. So now what we can do is we can actually reproduce this. So we group that lot together. Then we can press Ctrl D to duplicate it. Ctrl D to duplicate the leaf again. Just going to flip this one so it looks a little bit different. So there we go, a simple border design. I have tweaked the flowers and I've reduced the shadows. Might have even been better without them, but that's hindsight. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time round.